It was supposed to be the happiest night of their lives, a perfect wedding, a love that defied all odds. But in a single moment, everything changed. What happened next will leave you speechless. Stay until the end to witness the shocking truth. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. The soft hum of a sewing machine filled the spacious atelier, the rhythmic sound blending seamlessly with the faint jazz music playing in the background. Camilla leaned forward, her slender fingers guiding the delicate fabric beneath the needle, the intricate beadwork shimmering under the overhead lights. She had been working on this piece for weeks, a bridal gown unlike any she had ever designed before. It was not for a client, not for a showcase. It was for herself. In just a few days, she would be walking down the aisle to marry the man who had captured her heart in a way no one else ever could. William Harrison was a name that carried weight. A man of immense wealth and power, he had built an empire from the ground up, turning real estate investments into a global dynasty. He was respected, admired, feared even, yet none of that had ever mattered to Camilla. To her, he was simply William, the man who had made her feel truly seen. His age was irrelevant, his billions inconsequential. She loved him for who he was, for the wisdom in his gaze, for the warmth of his laughter, for the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Their love had not come without scrutiny. Whispers followed them wherever they went, people questioning, speculating, assuming the worst. A young black woman with an older white billionaire? The rumors had been endless. Some called her an opportunist, others accused him of trying to reclaim youth through her. But none of them understood. None of them saw the quiet moments, the late-night conversations, the way he supported her dreams without hesitation, the way she cherished him in return. Their love was not built on convenience or circumstance. It was built on something deeper, something unshakable. But not everyone believed in it. Her father, especially, had made his disapproval clear. A man of strong principles, he had spent his life fighting for what he believed was right, raising his daughter to be independent, strong-willed, and proud of her roots. To him, William was a symbol of everything he distrusted, a rich, white man who had lived a life of privilege. He refused to see the love between them, refused to acknowledge that William had never tried to own Camilla, never tried to control her. Instead, he saw only an imbalance, a relationship that, in his eyes, could never be truly equal. Their conversations had been tense, filled with words Camilla wished she could erase. She had begged him to understand, to see William the way she did. But her father was unyielding, his skepticism unwavering. When she told him they were getting married, he had simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, and said, "I hope, for your sake, that you're right about him." Despite his disapproval, she had pressed forward. Their wedding was set to be an event unlike any other, a celebration of love and commitment on a scale that would be remembered for years. The estate they had chosen sat atop a mountain, overlooking the ocean, the cliffs offering a breathtaking view of the endless blue horizon. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the cascading white roses that would line the aisle to the candlelit reception that would transform the glass pavilion into a scene straight out of a dream. William had spared no expense, not because he wanted to show off, but because he wanted this moment to be perfect for her. "Whatever you want, my love," he had told her, his fingers brushing over her cheek as they lay together one evening. "This day belongs to you." Now, as she sat in her atelier, Running her hands over the delicate embroidery of her gown, she felt a rush of emotions that she could hardly contain. Excitement, anticipation, a flicker of nervousness that had nothing to do with doubt, but everything to do with the magnitude of what was about to happen. She was about to become Mrs. Harrison. She was about to step into a new life, one that she had chosen with her whole heart. The sound of a knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see her father standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as always. He stepped inside, his eyes briefly landing on the gown before meeting hers. "You're really going through with this," he said, his voice even. She exhaled, standing up, smoothing the fabric of her dress before facing him fully. "Yes, I am." He studied her for a long moment, as if searching for something in her eyes, some sign of hesitation, some crack in her resolve, but he found none. "You know my feelings," he said finally, "but you're my daughter. And at the end of the day, that's what matters." It was not an approval, not an acceptance, but it was something, a small step toward something that perhaps, with time, could become understanding. She nodded, the tension between them still present but softened, if only slightly. "Thank you for coming." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. "This was your mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate gold bracelet, its surface worn with time, but still gleaming in the light. "She would have wanted you to have it." A lump formed in her throat as she took the box, her fingers trembling slightly. "Dad, just promise me one thing," he said, meeting her gaze with something close to desperation, "that if you ever realize you've made a mistake, you won't be too proud to walk away." A million responses formed in her mind, but in the end she simply nodded. "I promise." He nodded in return, turning toward the door. Just before he left, he looked back at her, his expression still guarded but carrying something softer now. "I'll be there tomorrow." And then he was gone. Camilla stood there for a long moment, clutching the bracelet in her hands, feeling the weight of everything that had led her to this moment. She had no doubts about William, no fears. What they had was real, and she would not let anyone take that away from them. Tomorrow she would marry the man she loved. And nothing, not whispers, not doubt, not even her father's reluctance, would change that. The morning of the wedding arrived with golden sunlight spilling over the cliffs, casting a warm glow over the vast ocean that stretched beyond the estate. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and fresh flowers, the entire venue buzzing with the hum of final preparations. Inside a private suite, Camilla sat before a wide mirror, her reflection framed by the cascading lace of her veil. Her heart pounded beneath her ribs, excitement mingling with the weight of the moment as her bridesmaids fluttered around her, adjusting every delicate detail of her gown. The dress was a masterpiece, custom-made, adorned with intricate beadwork that shimmered like scattered stars, its flowing fabric a perfect fusion of elegance and cultural heritage. Every inch of it told a story, her story, and today she would walk toward the man who had become her greatest love. Beyond the heavy doors of the bridal suite, guests were already arriving, their voices drifting through the estate in waves of laughter and conversation. The guest list had grown into the hundreds, filled with some of the most influential figures from the fashion and architectural worlds, along with family and close friends. William had insisted on nothing but the best, not out of excess, but because he wanted their wedding to be a moment neither of them would ever forget. From the towering floral arrangements to the handcrafted invitations, every element had been curated to perfection. The ceremony itself was set to take place in an open-air courtyard where rows of white roses formed a canopy above the guests, their delicate petals catching the soft ocean breeze. At the heart of it all stood an altar overlooking the Atlantic, the setting sun promising to bathe the scene in hues of amber and gold just as they exchanged their vows. Camilla exhaled slowly, gripping the arms of the chair as her mother approached from behind, her hands resting gently on her daughter's shoulders. "You look beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Camilla met her gaze in the mirror, seeing the unshed tears that shimmered in her mother's eyes. "Are you ready?" Camilla nodded, though the weight in her chest was impossible to ignore. Not nerves, not doubt, but the sheer enormity of the moment. She was about to become William's wife, about to step into a new chapter of her life. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, not of fear, but of exhilaration. Beyond the courtyard, in a separate wing of the estate, William stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting the crisp cuffs of his ivory suit. The fabric was tailored to perfection, the color chosen specifically to complement the softness of Camilla's gown. He had never been a man to fuss over appearances, but today was different. Today, he wanted everything to be perfect. His best man, an old friend and business partner, clapped a hand on his shoulder, grinning. "Nervous?" William smirked, shaking his head. "No, just eager." And he was. More than anything, he was ready to see her, to watch her walk toward him, to promise her forever. Outside, the music had begun to play, signaling that it was time. The guests had taken their seats, the murmurs fading into a quiet hush as the ceremony began. William stood at the altar, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes fixed on the entrance where Camilla would soon appear. The anticipation was electric. A collective breath held as the first chords of the wedding march echoed through the courtyard. Then the doors opened. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Camilla stepped forward, her figure framed by the golden light of the setting sun. Time seemed to slow, the entire world shrinking until there was only her. Her veil cascaded behind her like a whisper of silk, the gown hugging her form before flowing effortlessly with each step. But it wasn't the dress, the intricate embroidery, or even the breathtaking setting that held William's attention. It was her eyes. Dark, luminous, filled with something so raw and powerful that it stole the breath from his lungs. He had never seen anything more beautiful. Camilla barely registered the guests, the admiring whispers, the soft gasps from those seeing her for the first time in her wedding dress. Her gaze was locked onto William, the man who had not only captured her heart, but had held it with unwavering devotion. Her father walked beside her, his grip firm yet hesitant, as if reluctant to let go. There was no joy in his expression, only the quiet acceptance of a man who had fought against something he could no longer deny. When they reached the altar, he paused, his gaze meeting William's with an unreadable intensity. Then, with a slow exhale, he gave a single nod before stepping back, surrendering his daughter to the man she had chosen. The officiant began to speak, but Camilla barely heard the words. Her entire world had narrowed to the space between them, to the way William's fingers brushed against hers as he took her hands in his. His touch was warm, steady, grounding her in the moment. When it was time for their vows, Camilla took a breath, willing her voice to remain steady despite the overwhelming emotion threatening to spill over. "William," she began, her fingers trembling slightly as they tightened around his, "you have been my greatest love, my truest friend, and my safest place. You have believed in me when I doubted myself, lifted me when I felt weak, and loved me without hesitation. Today, I promise to do the same for you. I promise to stand beside you, to love you fiercely, to choose you every single day for the rest of my life." William's jaw tightened, his grip on her hands firm as he swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Camilla," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "from the moment you came into my life, you have been my light, my joy. You have given me something I never thought I would find, a love that defies time, expectation, and doubt. I vow to cherish you, to honor you, to spend every remaining day of my life proving to you just how deeply I love you." The officiant asked for the rings, and with careful hands they slid them onto each other's fingers. The moment felt suspended in time, a pause before the inevitable conclusion, before the words that would bind them forever. "By the power vested in me," the officiant declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." A cheer erupted from the crowd as William pulled Camilla into his arms, pressing a deep, lingering kiss to her lips. The world blurred for a moment, the grand setting, the hundreds of guests, the weight of the event fading into insignificance. There was only this moment, this love, this promise of forever. When they finally pulled apart, Camilla laughed breathlessly, her fingers tracing the edge of William's jaw as he smiled down at her, brushing a stray curl from her face. The reception awaited, an extravagant celebration that would stretch long into the night. But for now, none of it mattered. They had found each other. They had chosen each other, and nothing else could compare to that. The reception was in full swing, a dazzling spectacle of laughter, music, and champagne that filled the grand glass pavilion with an air of pure celebration. Golden candlelight flickered across the tables adorned with extravagant floral arrangements, casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests who moved seamlessly between conversation and dancing. Camilla and William floated through it all, their hands never straying far from each other, their faces glowing with the joy of the evening. Every time their eyes met, there was a silent exchange. Love, gratitude, the unspoken promise that they had finally arrived at the life they had dreamed of together. They danced, they laughed, they toasted to the future with friends and family who had traveled from all over the world to witness this moment. As the evening progressed, the speeches began, each one a tribute to the love they shared. William's best man spoke first, reminiscing about the days when William swore he had no time for love, only for business, and how meeting Camilla had changed everything. Friends and family followed, sharing stories of their journey, their undeniable connection, their ability to silence even the harshest skeptics with the authenticity of their devotion. Camilla's mother spoke with warmth and pride, her words carrying the weight of years of hope for her daughter's happiness. Then, as the guests settled into the glow of shared memories and flowing champagne, Camilla's father stood at the center of the room. The air seemed to still as he cleared his throat, his expression unreadable as he addressed the crowd. "This is a night to remember," he began, his deep voice commanding the attention of everyone present. "Not just for Camilla and William, but for all of us who have witnessed what true love looks like. I'll be the first to admit I did not see it at first. I doubted, I questioned, but standing here tonight I can say that I was wrong." A murmur of surprise rippled through the guests, and Camilla felt a lump form in her throat. She reached for William's hand beneath the table, gripping it tightly as her father continued. "A love like this deserves to be celebrated, and I wanted to give you both something that would mark the beginning of this new journey in a way that neither of you will ever forget." He gestured toward the terrace, and as the doors swung open, the crowd gasped. Beyond the glass, beneath the glow of the estate lights, a sleek, high-end helicopter sat waiting on the private helipad. The black and gold exterior gleamed against the night, its rotor blades still. The murmurs of excitement turned into applause, a wave of exhilaration spreading through the guests as realization dawned. It was a gift unlike any other, an experience, a moment frozen in time before reality came rushing back in. A flight over the coastline, her father explained, turning back to Camilla and William. A chance to see the world from a new perspective, together. William let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Your father's full of surprises," he murmured against Camilla's ear. She turned to him, her eyes wide with wonder. "This is insane," she whispered, her lips parting in a smile. "Are you up for it?" He squeezed her hand. "With you? Always." The guests erupted into cheers as the couple stood, the excitement infectious as they made their way toward the terrace. Photographers rushed forward, cameras flashing to capture the moment. They paused for one final picture, the reception lights behind them painting the scene in golden hues. Camilla's father clapped William on the shoulder as they passed. "Take care of her," he said, his voice low but firm. William met his gaze and nodded. "Always." The pilot stood at the entrance, nodding respectfully. "We're ready when you are, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison." Camilla felt a thrill of anticipation as they climbed inside. The interior was sleek and luxurious, the seats plush, the cabin designed for comfort. She reached for William's hand as the pilot began his pre-flight check, and he squeezed it reassuringly. The engines roared to life, the rotors picking up speed, sending a gust of wind swirling through the terrace. From inside the pavilion, the guests watched with eager anticipation, raising their glasses in a final toast as the helicopter lifted into the sky. Camilla exhaled, her heart pounding with exhilaration as the ground fell away beneath them, the estate shrinking into a sea of twinkling lights. Below, the coastline stretched endlessly, the waves crashing against the cliffs in rhythmic pulses. The moon cast its silver glow over the ocean, transforming the water into a mirror of shifting light. "This is incredible," she murmured, leaning in to William's side. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, his hand resting against the curve of her waist. "So are you." For a while, they simply took it all in, the rhythmic hum of the helicopter lulling them into a sense of peace. Everything about this night had been perfect. Every single moment had been magic. Then, suddenly, it wasn't. The first jolt was subtle, barely noticeable over the sound of the rotors. Camilla frowned, straightening slightly. "Did you feel that?" William's grip on her hand tightened. "Yes." Another jolt, this one stronger. The helicopter dipped slightly, the motion abrupt enough to send a sharp pang of unease through her chest. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset, tense but controlled. "We've hit an unexpected crosswind. Hold on." William's arm came around her, pulling her closer, his body instinctively shifting to shield her. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his jaw. Another violent lurch. This time the helicopter tilted unnaturally. The instrument panel flashed red, the alarms began blaring. Camilla's pulse spiked. Panic clawed at her throat. "What's happening?" The pilot's voice came again, this time sharper. "Losing stability. We need to—" Another sudden drop. A sharp gust of wind slammed into them, sending the aircraft spiraling sideways. Camilla barely had time to scream before William pulled her into his chest, his grip unyielding as the world outside blurred into a sickening spin. The ocean, once calm and endless, was now a rapidly approaching abyss. The alarms screamed louder. The pilot fought with the controls, his movements desperate. "Brace!" The impact came before the words could finish. The world shattered into chaos. Metal collided with rock in a deafening roar. Glass exploded into 1,000 jagged shards. The force of the crash ripped through the cabin, sending them tumbling in violent spirals as the helicopter crumpled upon impact. The smell of fuel filled the air, thick and acrid. Sparks flew, igniting flames that spread rapidly, licking hungrily at the wreckage. Camilla's body slammed against something hard, pain searing through her limbs, the breath stolen from her lungs. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the ringing in her ears, the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs. Then, slowly, reality bled back in. She was alive. Barely. The world around her was tilted, distorted. Smoke curled through the air, thick and suffocating. The ground beneath her trembled, a low groan of shifting wreckage warning of the impending collapse. She turned her head, her vision swimming. William. Her heart lurched. He was slumped against the wreckage, his face obscured by blood and soot, his once pristine suit torn and darkened. His chest barely rose, his breaths shallow. "William," she rasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. No response. Fear crashed over her like a tidal wave. The wreckage creaked, the ground beneath them unstable. They had to move. They had to get out. But William wasn't waking up. And as the fire crept closer, licking at the twisted metal, Camilla knew one horrifying truth. If she didn't move now, if she didn't fight, neither of them would survive. The world was chaos. Flames licked hungrily at the remains of the helicopter, their heat searing against Camilla's skin as she fought to stay conscious. Smoke curled through the shattered fuselage, thick and suffocating, filling her lungs with every ragged breath. Her body ached, every muscle screaming in protest as she tried to move, but she had no choice. She had to move. She had to find William. Her fingers trembled as she pushed against the ground, shards of metal and glass digging into her palms as she forced herself upright. The world tilted violently, pain lancing through her ribs as she struggled to focus. Her vision swam, dark spots clouding the edges, but through the thick haze of smoke she saw him. William lay slumped against the twisted remains of his seat, his face barely visible beneath streaks of blood and soot. His suit, once pristine, was torn and darkened, the fabric clinging to his body where injuries had painted it crimson. Camilla's breath caught. He wasn't moving. "William," she choked out, her voice raw and weak. She reached for him, her fingers closing around his arm as she shook him gently. He didn't respond. Panic surged through her, sharp and cold, drowning out the fire's roar. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to ignore the pain as she shook him harder. "William, wake up! Please, wake up!" A low, pained groan slipped past his lips. Relief crashed into her so hard she nearly sobbed. He was alive, but they weren't safe. Not yet. The wreckage beneath them groaned, metal scraping against stone as the remains of the helicopter shifted dangerously. A horrible realization settled in her gut like ice. They were too close to the cliff's edge. If the wreckage gave way, if they didn't get out now, they would plummet into the darkness below. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she grabbed William by the shoulders, shaking him again. His eyelids fluttered, a weak, barely there motion, but it was enough. His lips parted slightly, his breath shallow and uneven. "Camilla," she cupped his face, her hands shaking. "I'm here," she whispered, "but we have to move, okay? We have to get out of here." He didn't respond, his gaze unfocused, but when she pulled at him, he groaned in pain. He was barely conscious, too weak to help himself. She would have to get them both out, and fast. The fire behind them crackled louder, consuming the wreckage piece by piece. Sparks rained down around them, sizzling as they met the damp earth. The acrid scent of burning fuel filled the air, the heat growing unbearable. Camilla fought through the terror clawing at her chest, her mind screaming at her to move. She hooked her arms beneath his shoulders, her muscles burning with the effort, as she began to drag him towards the jagged opening where the fuselage had split upon impact. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through her, but she pushed forward, inch by agonizing inch. William groaned with every pull, but he didn't resist. He was too weak, his body limp in her arms. The wreckage groaned again, the cliffside crumbling beneath them. Another jolt sent them skidding forward, closer to the edge. Camilla's heart slammed against her ribs. She couldn't stop now. "Come on, baby," she panted, her grip tightening around him. "Just a little more." Her ribs screamed in protest, her vision blurred. But finally, she pulled them both free from the wreckage, tumbling onto solid ground just as another explosion rocked the remains of the helicopter. The blast sent a wave of heat rolling over her, debris flying in every direction. She threw herself over William, shielding him as best she could, her body curling around his. Silence followed. A heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the distant roar of the ocean. Camilla gasped for air, her lungs burning. She forced herself onto her hands and knees, crawling toward William. His breathing was still too shallow, his skin growing colder beneath her touch. She pressed her fingers against his pulse, desperate for any sign of strength. "Stay with me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, William, stay with me." His fingers twitched weakly, barely brushing against her arm. His lips parted, but no sound came. A sob threatened to break free from her chest, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't break now. Somewhere in the distance, past the howling wind and the crackling flames, she thought she heard voices. Faint, distant, but real. Help was coming, but would it come soon enough? The wreckage behind them let out a final, tortured groan. Camilla turned just in time to see it give way, slipping over the edge of the cliff with a sickening screech of metal against rock. The helicopter vanished into the abyss, the darkness swallowing it whole. A second later, a distant explosion sent a plume of fire and smoke shooting into the sky. Camilla's body shook violently, her breath ragged. If they had been seconds slower. She turned back to William, pressing her forehead against his. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, willing it to be true. "Help is coming. Just hold on." His lashes fluttered, his eyes barely opening. "Camilla." His voice was barely there, fragile and broken. She cupped his face, brushing his blood-matted hair away from his forehead. "I'm here," she choked out. "I've got you." His gaze met hers, something heavy and unspoken passing between them. His lips parted again, his breath faltering. "I love you." Her heart fractured. "Don't do this," she whispered fiercely, shaking her head. "You don't get to say goodbye. We're getting out of this. Do you hear me?" He tried to smile, but it barely formed before his eyes fluttered closed again. The sound of sirens cut through the night, distant but growing louder. Flashing lights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness like beacons. Camilla gripped William's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Stay with me," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Just a little longer." But his body was so still, so terrifyingly still. The world around her blurred, the sounds of the approaching rescue team fading into the background as she clung to him, whispering his name over and over. And as the first responders reached them, as hands pulled her away and voices shouted orders, only one thought remained in her mind. Was she already too late? The estate was silent, the air thick with a suffocating weight that pressed down on every one who remained. Where there had once been music, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses, there was now only the distant murmur of hushed voices, the occasional sob that broke through the stunned silence. The grand reception hall, once glowing with warmth and celebration, now felt hollow, its golden candlelight flickering against untouched plates and abandoned glasses. The wedding had become a wake in the blink of an eye. The guests who had gathered to witness a love story now stood frozen in the grip of horror, their joyous expressions replaced with ones of disbelief and grief. Word had spread like wildfire. The helicopter was gone, crashed. Flames had lit up the sky in a burst of devastation, the wreckage consumed by fire before plummeting into the abyss below. No one knew the full extent of what had happened, only that one moment they were watching the newlyweds take flight, and the next they were staring at the darkened horizon, smoke curling into the night like the last breath of a dying dream. The first responders had been called immediately, but there was no certainty, no reassurance, only the terrifying unknown. Camilla's father stood near the entrance of the estate, his hands trembling as he clutched the railing. His face was pale, drained of all color, his expression unreadable as he stared out toward the cliffs. He had given them that helicopter, his gift, his idea. The weight of it pressed into his chest like a vice, crushing the breath from his lungs. His daughter was out there, somewhere in the wreckage, and all he could do was wait. His wife stood beside him, her hand covering her mouth, her body trembling as silent tears streamed down her face. She had never cried like this before, not even when she lost her own mother, not even when life had thrown its cruelest obstacles in their path. This was different. This was unnatural. This was the kind of pain that shattered something inside a person that could never be repaired. William's closest friends, his colleagues, the men and women who had worked alongside him for decades, stood in a tight cluster, their usually composed faces stricken with shock. He was supposed to be invincible. William Harrison did not fall, did not falter, did not lose. And yet, now, his fate was unknown, his future hanging in the balance, and there was nothing they could do to change it. The whispers had already started among the guests. Some tried to convince themselves that he would survive, that he was too powerful, too strong to be taken down by something as senseless as an accident. Others lowered their heads, their expressions grim, knowing that even the strongest men could not bargain with fate. Time dragged painfully. The night stretched on, the minutes crawling by with agonizing slowness. Then, finally, the sirens came. The sound cut through the estate like a blade, sending a ripple of movement through the guests as they rushed toward the entrance. Red and blue lights flashed against the stone walls, illuminating the waiting crowd with an eerie glow. The rescue team emerged first, their faces drawn, their uniforms streaked with soot and sweat. The lead paramedic approached with measured steps, his gaze heavy with what he was about to say. Camilla's father stepped forward, his breath shallow, his entire body rigid. "Where is she?" His voice cracked, the strength he was known for fracturing beneath the weight of fear. The paramedic hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "She's alive." A collective gasp swept through the crowd, but the relief was short-lived. "She's in critical condition, severe trauma, possible internal bleeding. We're transporting her to the nearest hospital now." Camilla's mother let out a strangled sob, her knees buckling as she clutched onto her husband for support. "And William?" The question came from one of his business partners, a man who had known him for years, who had built empires alongside him. The paramedic's silence was answer enough. "We found him at the crash site," he finally said, his voice quieter now. He didn't make it." The world tilted. A low, guttural sound tore from Camilla's mother's throat, a wail of pure, raw agony that shattered whatever illusion of composure had remained. Gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire, grief rippling through the crowd in waves. William Harrison was dead. The man who had stood at the altar just hours ago, who had kissed his bride under the glow of chandeliers, who had promised her forever, was gone. The reality of it hit like a brutal, unforgiving force. The murmurs turned into sobs, some guests breaking down entirely, others simply standing in stunned silence, unable to process what had just been said. Camilla's father's hands curled into fists at his sides. His own breath came in short, ragged bursts, his mind spinning with the unbearable weight of it all. He had doubted this marriage, had questioned William's place in his daughter's life, but never, not once, had he wanted this. The guilt was unbearable. This had been his gift, his decision. If he hadn't, if he had just... His wife clung to him, her nails digging into his arm as she shook her head, as if trying to will this nightmare away. But there was no escaping it. Somewhere among the wreckage, in the ruins of what was supposed to be the happiest night of their lives, lay the remnants of their love story, shattered beyond repair. The guests, one by one, lowered their heads, their tears falling onto the stone floors of the estate that had once been filled with celebration. The night that was supposed to mark the beginning of a lifetime had instead become an epitaph. The headlines would spread within hours. William Harrison, billionaire real estate mogul, killed in tragic helicopter crash on his wedding night. The world would mourn him, the industry would grieve him, but none of it would compare to the devastation that had been left behind within these walls. And yet, in the distance, carried by the night wind, something moved. A piece of fabric, caught in the breeze, drifting slowly before settling among the wildflowers growing along the edge of the cliff. Camilla's veil, torn, stained with ash and soot, its delicate lace whispering a story of love, of loss, of something beautiful that had burned too bright, too fast, and had been taken before its time. It would remain there, untouched, a silent memorial to a love that had defied the odds, but not the cruelty of fate. Some stories don't end the way we expect. Love, fate, and tragedy collided in a way no one could have foreseen. What do you think about this heartbreaking tale? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories.